Hi, Laszlo. How are you doing?
Could you say hi to Alyssa?
Would you like to answer the question yourself?
It's like, I have some thoughts.
I have some thoughts about...
The only way to ensure safety is treats. Okay.
Hey guys, welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from GoodMorhen, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international hanza accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cirilla of Cintra, across the continent. So, as you know, we are celebrating 5 years of the show on August 15th. So exciting. I can't believe I've been doing this for half a freaking decade. And I'm so grateful to all of you and all the friendships that we've made over the course of these last 5 years. A couple of announcements regarding that. Stay tuned for new art and apparel, celebrating the 5th anniversary of the podcast in the Breakfast in Beauclair shop. I am so excited to be partnering with some beloved artists in our community to bring together some new designs for the celebration. Also, I'm planning on releasing a special episode of Breakfast in Beauclair on August 15th, which happens to land on a Thursday, of course, as a look back and a thank you to our community. So if you have any audio or video thank you notes, shout outs that you would like to submit to be included either in that special episode of the podcast or in social media posts, feel free to record those. Keep that to like 15 to 60 seconds and send that to either greetings@breakfastinbeauclair.com or DM them to me on Discord. And the next time that you guys hear from me, I will be on my way to Poland and returning from Poland for those celebrations with Anita, Carolina from Witcher Kitchen, and other familiar faces. So excited for that trip, and it's very surreal that I will finally be there with them. This episode, we welcome back Maddie, aka Red Kite, to our producer level patrons on Patreon, which include Katie, the redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B., Charlotte from Bangberg Glamorai, the original Roach, Libby, John of Riblia, Tom from Australia, Jill Kate the Tabby Witch, Ollie from Sweden, James Carson III, Miriam of Temeria, Softy, and Lisa C. If you'd like to learn more about supporting Breakfast in Beauclair, visit patreon.com/breakfastinbeauclair. As for this episode, Danny and Kerri from the US call in for Netflix's The Witcher, episode 307, Out of the Fire, Into the Frying Pan. Join us as we discuss how to successfully adapt a solo storyline, breaking down the visual effects in the Korath Desert, Ciri's readiness and internal conflicts, her visions, Falka's influence, and preposition soup. Without further ado, let's get to our discussion of Netflix's The Witcher, episode 307, Out of the Fire, Into the Frying Pan. Hey guys, welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair. My name is Alyssa, and today we're welcoming 2 members of our hanza to the show. My first guest is a visual effects editor based in Los Angeles, who you'll recognize from his appearance on episode 74, 104 of Mages, Malice, and Monstrous Mayhem from Netflix's The Witcher: Blood Origin. His latest editing credit is the recently released film Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, which stars a familiar face, Witcher actress Freya Allen. My second guest is a clinical psychologist in the public sector. Her extracurricular interests include fashion and style, specifically regarding gender biases that are the product and perpetuation of professional dress codes. She is interested in promoting health without colluding with diet and fitness industrial complexes and supports the representation of diverse bodies in media. She's an amateur sewer and macrame maker and earned her Wine and Spirit Education Trust Level 2 award in wines last fall. Please welcome Danny and Kerri from the US. Hey guys, it's so lovely to have you on the show.
Hello.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yes. Well, Danny, welcome back.
Thank you.
And it's so lovely that you have your beautiful wife with you as well, Kerri. Kerri, welcome. It's so nice to have you for the first time. And as always, why don't you tell us how you got into The Witcher / who got whom into The Witcher?
Yeah, so I had heard that Netflix was going to make this series and that they were based on books. I actually started with reading the books, and then we figured out there was a video game. And so during the pandemic, Danny started playing the video game. And that's actually how I came to Breakfast in Beauclair. First podcast ever, was looking for something different. Danny said, hey, why don't you pick something that you're interested in and see if there's a podcast? And so I searched around for Witcher and found you, and that's what I listened to when I sewed my masks and did stuff around the house.
Right, during the
Yeah.
pandemic, because you were still going into the
Yeah.
to
I
work.
had to go into the hospital every day, so
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was not. So
quite the mask collection I had.
Well, that's amazing. Were you always a fan of fantasy? Is that why The Witcher appealed to you? Or
Yeah, I like the fantasy. I like the idea of magic. Dragons are a lot of fun, those kinds of books, which is why I liked Game of Thrones and thought that maybe this could be something similar, even though I hadn't read those books. And I thought Netflix was doing some cool things and that it would probably be pretty good. And so I thought, well, hey, let's get into this.
And were you a Cavill? You were like, oh, Henry Cavill's in this.
I
Like,
mean,
maybe
who
we'll
doesn't
check
love a
it out.
Cavill, right? Like, come on.
that was probably the draw for many people.
Probably, yeah. He gets the ticket sold, right? Yeah.
And Danny, how are you? You had such an awesome milestone lately. Congratulations on the release of Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes.
Thank you.
So many prepositions in there.
Yeah, it's funny because it's not my first Planet of the Apes movie, so I'm well acquainted to the of those, having done Dawn of the Planet of the Apes in a different role just about 10 years ago. So it's been kind of a crazy cycle back, working with a lot of the same people I had worked with back then. And it was an incredibly great experience working with a great crew. And then, yeah, went to the premiere last week, which is a lot of fun. I don't always get invited to those, being below the line and whatnot, but great experience. A lot of fun to work on. Pretty crazy work-wise. With all the modern Planet of the Apes movies, it's all motion capture, but in live action locations for the most part. In this case, our production team was out in Australia, and you had actors in gray, basically pajama suits with sensors
Little
on
balls,
it.
right?
Yeah. And then in our case, our vendor, Weta, who does the Avatar movies as well, they specialize in, they have like these active sensors. So it's not always even the balls. It's like those suits are lined with like wired up and with active sensors and special cameras that pick up those sensors even out in the wild and
Wow.
shoot that. And so that leads to, for visual effects editing side of it, when a scene was cut, we would have to work with the director to select clean plates, because even though that CG apes would be bigger than human bodies for the most part, they're not positioned the same. And so in order to get rid of those actors in the actual performance plate, or ideally use the clean plate as the plate that then they put the CG apes into, that was probably the most complex part of it, because of course when there is actors in the actual frame, the camera move's going to be much better for the director. And so a lot of the times, like, well, can we use the performance plate and get rid of the actors, as opposed to putting just CG apes into the clean plates. So a lot of fun, but definitely complex work on our end.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I have like a very clear memory. I think it was the second Pirates of the Caribbean film. Wasn't that the film that they actually started to record those together, like mocap on location rather than separately? I remember watching the behind the scenes, like in the DVD,
Yeah.
and they were just like, this is a big deal that this is happening.
Yeah, I think Davy
yeah.
Jones.
Yeah, the guy with the octopus.
Yeah.
So it's like
Yeah.
doing that and that sort of thing, which is actually funny. Though it reminds me of a conversation I was having with our visual effects supervisor, where he made some comment about like, oh, Freya may not be used to like acting with, nobody, or like somebody in a gray suit or whatever. And I'm like, well, actually, on season 2 of The Witcher,
She's fine.
that was the first episode, and the Neverland, where they had the facial cameras and did his character up. Because that was one thing that everybody said from production, was that Freya was very good at, so she's a human character in the movie.
Right.
And so she would do a lot of clean plates where she's acting without anybody. And there was this one where she gets kind of pulled away by an ape and did it particularly well without anybody there doing that action and stuff. So
Yeah.
she definitely brought some of that experience from Witcher seasons of acting with nobody.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing to hear that she's, having success outside of the franchise and outside of Netflix as well. Really, really awesome for her, and I'm glad to hear it. But speaking of her acting alone, that kind of takes us to the episode that we're going to discuss today. And today we'll continue our discussion of Netflix's The Witcher Season 3 with episode 307, Out of the Fire into the Frying Pan, in which Ciri endures the ultimate test of survival on a desperate journey under the harshest of conditions. Here's a quick synopsis of the episode from future Alyssa. In episode 307, Out of the Fire into the Frying Pan, after stepping into the monolith in Tor Lara at the end of the last episode, Ciri lands in a desert unconscious. Meanwhile, Jaskier looks for Geralt and Ciri among the ruins of Aretuza. Instead, he finds Radovid surrounded by his dead guards. The bard learns what happened during the coup. Radovid asks Jaskier for forgiveness, but breaks the news that Ciri might be dead. Jaskier and Yennefer reunite, and the sorceress tells him that Triss has brought Geralt to Brokilon. In Brokilon, the Queen of the Dryads, Aithne, and another woman speak over the Witcher. Ciri wakes alone and deduces from the sand that she must be in the Korath desert. She sets her dislocated shoulder and tries to communicate with Yennefer using their shared talisman. Desperate, she rummages through her things, eating a tin of ointment. Night falls and she keeps walking through the desert, but finds herself back where she started as morning breaks. A unicorn unexpectedly saves Ciri from a sand monster that she had mistaken for a pool of water. Confused and in disbelief, she follows it into a sandstorm. Desperate for food, Ciri eats raw lizard eggs. Her mother, Pavetta, appears in a hallucination, chastising her for her unprincess-like behavior. The vision tells her that she's been abandoned once more, and rightly so, as she's a burden to others. Ciri cries back that Pavetta abandoned her by not taking her on the boat that led to her death. Angered by the dark thoughts, Ciri kills and eats the lizard. She has a vision of a cloaked woman in an inn, showing Ciri both the past and the future. The vision insists that history must repeat itself. Ciri awakes to find the unicorn waiting for her. He leads her to a true water source, where Ciri uses her chaos to find it and finally drink. Together, they help each other survive. Ciri has a vision of Calanthe, who she tells to go away. The vision of Calanthe berates her for not being more involved as the continent marches toward war. Ciri argues that Calanthe brought Cintra to ruin. The cloaked figure returns in the night, revealing herself as Falka, the forgotten princess who famously slaughtered her family and incited a rebellion. Falka appeals to Ciri, telling her that to change the system, she must burn it. An insectoid desert monster attacks Little Horse and Ciri. Ciri eventually kills the beast, but the unicorn is critically wounded during the fight. Ciri tries her best to dress the wounds, but she can't help with the venom spreading through the unicorn. Her vision of Falka coerces her into using fire magic to heal it. Ciri resists, citing Yennefer's warnings and Aretuza's bans. Desperate to keep her friend from dying, Ciri draws magic from the campfire, healing Little Horse, and he runs off. Falka encourages Ciri to follow a path of revenge against not just her enemies, but her loved ones as well. Ciri refuses to give up Geralt, Yennefer, and Jaskier and abruptly relinquishes her powers instead. Ciri wakes up amongst a group of trappers who take her to an unknown seeker. Jaskier steps to the edge of Brokilon looking for Geralt. He sings to the Dryads hidden in the trees, bringing them to tears. Eventually, Milva brings him to Geralt. Along the way, Jaskier passes the Scoia'tael who are taking refuge in Brokilon, including Dara. Jaskier reveals to Geralt that Ciri is on her way to Nilfgaard. Now that we've gotten a quick synopsis of the episode, I would love to hear more from you both about what your overall thoughts are. So what did you think about the story and the plot, the costumes, production, any kind of hanging thoughts before we start to get into our discussion questions?
When I first thought about this episode, I kind of thought like, oh God, what are they going to do? Because it's almost entirely a bottle episode. She's by herself. It's in the desert. And, when I was reading the books, this sort of chapter was just something that I was sort of like, Ciri's off in the desert, right? Whatever. But I actually thought that they did a fantastic job. I thought it was really interesting how she had the self-talk. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just sort of like an internal dialogue with her voice in the background, but she actually said things to herself. And then they made the choice of having which characters outside for her to interact with during the episodes of, whether she's having a vision or some sort of hallucination and, however we interpret that to be. I thought that that was really interesting in a way that wasn't boring. I also think that it really was an opportunity for Freya to shine because I never saw this series as really her story, but it is. And so, my relationship with the character of Ciri has actually become better because of the Netflix series, because I feel like she's so much more fleshed out. I like her. I think she's funny. She's very three-dimensional. And I think that they really set it up perfectly for this to be an episode that people could watch and engage with and not fall asleep, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think on that note, I think in the books, it feels like there's no agency for her whatsoever. And I feel like in this episode, feels like there's some sort of agency for her character. But I also feel like, again, back to having just worked on a movie that she was in, she does feral incredibly well.
Yeah.
And I think this episode shows that very well, and the movie does as well. I'm guessing and I'm hoping that more of that will come out in her character, at least through some future plot lines with the rats and whatnot, because I feel like there's a certain part of her that now gets to come out that's less afraid all the time, or less going with the flow of like, well, I just kind of meander through whoever's trying to use me for whatever purpose, and try and find agency for herself as a character a bit.
Absolutely. I think we've talked continually on the podcast about The Witcher being Ciri's coming of age. And, you kind of have that fall happen. Obviously, with the fall of Cintra, you have it happen again. I think even more substantially when Thanet happens, when she's alone in the desert, and when she actually breaks with the reality of everything that she's known thus far. So I think, that's spot on. We are going to see such a incredible transformation in this character. And I'm really excited to see what Freya Allen brings to it, because she's great. She's been fantastic this run.
And then as an episode as a whole, it's funny, I continually forget about the fact that there's other stuff in there too. It's not
Yeah.
just Ciri in the desert. And for better or worse, it all functions pretty well to drive the story forward. I had reread the chapters from the book before, kind of rewatching it as well. And doing Brokilon with Jaskier giving the rundown of what's going on elsewhere in the continent, I feel like functions way better in the way they did it in the show by breaking that up, because in the end, as much as a slog that I was worried that Ciri alone in the desert would be, rereading the chapter prior of Jaskier kind of just going through, what everything's going on, even though it bounces to those locations, that rereading was a bit of a slog. And I think that as an episode on its own would have been pretty rough. And I think breaking it up the way they did to give a couple breaks within the structure of Ciri in the desert worked out well, as well as bookending in some ways to kind of really be like, all right, we're moving forward. This is kind of a big moment, but also everybody else is scattering and going their own ways as well, and kind of leading up to the final episode of the season that's really pushing everybody on their journeys now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. They always have like a serious like penultimate episode, right? And I think that this is sort of the penultimate episode of the entire series, is that everything you once knew is gone. All hell is breaking loose. And it's just forks in the road, right? Like Ciri is in an existential crisis in the desert, right? The Dryads are letting people in when typically they were like, don't bother us. We won't bother you. Geralt is seriously injured. He's not the baddest on the continent anymore. There's competition. The stakes are even higher. Jasker's reporting on how villages are burning all over the continent. It really is a time of contempt. But just really a lot of uncertainty. And, I imagine that there's a lot of strategic discussions happening all over the place with a lot of uncertainty and not your mama's battle plan, it's a lot of different turning everything that you knew on your head. And with this, sort of we find out at the end of the episode is that everybody actually thinks that Ciri is on her way to Emir. And that fact is sort of, people are going to make decisions based on that fact, which is also like throwing a wrench in the works. So it really is just turning everything on its side, which, as a viewer, I think is kind of exciting because it's unpredictable and you want to see more, you want to hear more. Keeps us interested.
Yeah. And while we're here and talking about the episode, Danny, I would love to hear a little bit of what you thought about the special effects specifically. There were a couple of obvious moments that viewers will know, the monster fights, for example, a Horrorquack's little horse's horn, another one. And I'm sure that there's a lot of special effects that most people won't recognize as CG, but that you might be able to spot. What did you think about the episode overall as someone who works in the industry?
Yeah, I thought it all functioned really well. I actually liked the design on Little Horse's unicorn horn. I think I'd seen some people were like not about it, but I thought it was integrated well and it gave a design that was both realistic, I guess you could say, but also not so hung up on trying to be realistic. I feel like there's a lot of current movies, visual effects in fantasy that's trying to overly anchor in reality. And these are all very basically non-real situations or characters or whatever that I feel like sometimes the design can get hung up on, got to make it look real. And it's like, you don't know what that really would look like. So play with
Right.
it a bit. And I feel like they did that pretty well overall, not just on his horn, but also with some of the monster design. I thought it was interesting that they added, compared to the book chapter, there's two monster attacks in the episode, with the main one from the book being more of just the first one she interacts with. And I thought that one was really well done. A clever use of the physical effect of the kind of like slime water before the
Yeah.
monster snaps its jaws and whatnot. And I think that one, being much more based off the book, was probably a little bit more straightforward to design. And then the second one, where they actually fight with it, I thought was actually a cool way to integrate evolutionary sort of mentality into the monster's design of the kind of rock shelling being meant for camouflage and drawing in potential creatures to eat or whatever, and both protection and as a predator. So I thought that was pretty well done and a clever way to use the visual effects of the monster while also giving Ciri a piece of that monster to then physically interact with, as Freya as the actor to tangibly touch as well, to then use that to kill the monster. Was a I feel like the more that you kind of bleed the line between the CG and physical effects makes them function better and integrate better and help the believability better on our end. I do think that the production team and design teams have a tough balance of continually coming up with new monsters and not like rehashing the same thing all the time, especially when you get in the world of maybe something that's more like insectoid, where you're kind of like, oh, it could have been more centipede like that we already saw on another version of the show, or, all of that sort of stuff. While I'm also assuming that they literally can't just take things from the games. And I think there's probably a certain amount of audience that wish they were literally doing that, because then you're like, oh, hey, I know that one. And while they're doing some stuff that seems similar to like the Jackapace, felt like a game monster that I'm guessing that that would involve licensing and money and all sorts of other stuff to literally pull from the games, that the production is doing an interesting job of changing it up enough without being too derivative of itself. Those were kind of the main things that stuck out to me. I'm sure that I've never been to Morocco, but I imagine that there's a whole bunch of cleanup that they had to do in the desert. But a lot of the desert scape looked amazing, and the shot at like night where she's like walking along the ridge and it's the stars and all of that all looked great and beautiful for a terrible place to be, and all of that. Again, not knowing what they had to clean out of it, I imagine there was some amount of work that had to be done there.
Yeah, to make it look as deserted a desert as it must have been.
Yeah.
So any particular highlights or lowlights that you guys had in this episode?
I love costumes. I think that it's one of the coolest things about movies and television is kind of the opportunity there. And I really loved on Falka's ears, the way that they stitched them. Because, she talks
Mhm.
about how she cut her ears into points and there's actually like stitches up her ear. It wasn't necessarily a necessary detail, but I thought it was kind of cool that they included that and did that. I loved how in the forest, the costumes were kind of like scrappy and put together. And I think for all intents and purposes, like not that cool because they were practical. But then the details and where their energy and the importance is to make their weapons. And so like the arrows that Milva has are like, they have that beautiful turquoise whatever it is on the end. I don't know. Is it a fletch? Yeah, feathers.
The
I'm an indoor
fletchling,
girl.
I
I don't
think?
know. The fletchlings, yeah. And I thought that that was really interesting. And then the idea that the dryads that were born of the forest had that kind of bark-like texture to their foreheads.
Yeah, that's new this season as well.
I think so. Yeah, yeah. Versus the dryads that were kind of adopted by the forest don't have those details.
Mhm.
So I thought that that was kind of, from a costume standpoint, those were really interesting details. Because there's not a whole lot going on with Ciri's outfit in the desert. That's just kind of the thing that she's been wearing for like a season and a half. And,
Yeah.
it is what it is.
Yeah, there is the survival aspect to it. They have like that whole scene of her tearing it apart,
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
making bandages out of it, making a
Right.
head wrap out of it.
Right.
Yeah, that was nice. But yeah, can't imagine trudging with that fur and those boots.
No. Yeah, no, definitely not. And then like around the collar. Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as lowlights for me, audiences are a bit more sophisticated these days. And so I could have maybe done with less repetition of history is repeating itself, history is repeating itself.
Mm.
I think the audience is aware that there's a lot of history and genealogy that's very important to the plot and that there's, a prophecy involved. I also, thought that at some point when she is having her discussion, I guess, with Calanthe, it sort of was very abrupt to be like, yeah, and these voices out here are trying to get me to kill myself, right? And it's like, to me, that conflict was very obvious.
Mm.
And there are things that were just like really obvious that I didn't feel like needed to be.
A little heavy-handed.
It's a little heavy-handed. And, like I work in that area, things are heavy. It is. Can kind of like trust your audience to pick up on the gravity of things and to
Mhm.
really understand what's going on in the plot. And I think that they were genuinely doing a very good job of showing it. And they maybe didn't need to tell it as much.
Yeah, definitely makes sense.
Yeah, in terms of highlights, I think a lot of the stuff we had already talked about, Ciri acting, all the actors actually in general, it's a good way of bringing back actors and characters that we had seen previously who are dead in the current part of the plot, but being able to bring back Calanthe and Pavetta again, I think it's a great way to do it, as well as serve a plot point and bring back those kind of highlights from previous seasons as well. And it's interesting because have always, from the beginning of the show, I was always like, I can't believe these are two different people at the time with like Pavetta and Ciri, and like, oh, these are actually two different actors because they just cast it so phenomenally. So reminding me of that is always fun for me, that I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, it was knocked out of the park. And the actress that plays Calanthe is always phenomenal as well.
Mhm.
And so this was a great way to bring her back. So I enjoyed all of that. I mean, episode as a whole was a pretty solid highlight for me on the season as well, especially kind of going into it not knowing what to expect on how it was going to play out, and my memory of the chapter from the book maybe being like slower than it was in retrospect and kind of worrying about that. But to me, it worked out well. I guess you could call it a low light or a disappointment. I could have used some more unicorn action in the episode that does appear in the book, but mostly for no other reason. I would have loved to forced somebody to have pronounced Little Horse's real name, because every time if I'm reading it or it's just listed somewhere, I just kind of like over it.
Yeah.
Like, that's just a space holder. I know what that stands for. I just don't know how I'd ever pronounce it.
Yeah, I let Peter Kenny be my guide and just follow that.
And even then, it's like I hear pronunciation. I think there was some behind the scenes video or something from the season that somebody may have like used his name. And I'm like, oh, that sounds right. And then it was like just gone. Like I then look at the word and it's like gone from my head. I'm like, I don't even remember how they pronounced it. And then I probably could have used maybe even more weirdness. I don't know if that's just the point in life I'm in, but I feel like they could have had it been truly a bottle episode or really leaned into kind of the craziness. I could have used the courage to like really go for it, but it's also coming off of, we just recently rewatched all of Twin Peaks, and the third season of that has like this kind of famous bottle episode that's just like, I don't even know what I just watched, and like in a good way. And I'm into those types of risk takes, I think, nowadays, and could have used a few more risks out of this episode. And now I just hope that they do continue to utilize Little Horse and unicorns in general in the future, because I sometimes worry that they kind of like, oh, here's a piece of something that was in the book, but we're not going to really do it all, even though this season was so heavily in line with Time of Contempt. Yeah, I guess the low light is not weird enough.
You're never going to out-weird Lynch.
That is true.
I mean, it's not, you know.
But still.
Yeah, I think for me, the highlights of the episode were really a lot of Freya Allen's acting. Like, she brought so much desperation and uncertainty to her character, and every single moment just felt so well done. Everything from the way that she was interacting with her visions of like her mother and grandmother, and her being able to carry those parts of the episode, particularly toward the beginning where she was genuinely alone and just kind of trudging. If we're talking about adaptations from the book, I think it would have been nice to see her use her magic a little bit more. I know that the only time that she really used her magic before the big fire scene was to kind of forcefully push away the monster that was fighting Horcrux. And that was toward the middle of the episode. And that's a spell that she tried to use at the beginning against the Jackapace in episode 1. So she did that unsuccessfully then, but she did it now. Because I think in the books, while she's in the desert at night, she's using magic to keep her warm. She's able to conjure like a little tiny ball of light. So I think little things like that would be able to show the viewer how much she's learned from Yennefer that she can still use on her own, so that it also makes the contrast between her having magic and having not having magic at the end a little bit more abrupt and obvious. I think that would have been a little nice. So, yeah.
And more of a, like, to truly relinquish that part of herself, probably would have ramped that up a bit more as well. That it's
like more of a loss. Yeah.
As opposed to this thing I kind of dabbled in, but whatever.
Yeah. And before we get to our discussion questions, quick Easter eggs from the show. So, out of the frying pan into the fire is not just a saying, it also happens to be a quest in The Witcher 3. This episode is called Out of the Fire into the Frying Pan, presumably out of the fire of Thanedd and into the frying pan, which is another name for the Korath Desert. The episode titles at the back half of the episode are very interesting and very different from everything else that they've done throughout the rest of the show.
Yeah.
It makes me making graphics very hard because the titles are so long, but it is like this title is very apt for this episode. While Ciri is marching through the desert at night, as well as in the credits of the episode, she sings a song called Little Sacrifice, and Freya Allen actually recorded that song herself and sounds stunning. But A Little Sacrifice is, of course, the short story that covers Geralt and the mermaid, Shinaz, and the whole Little Mermaid Sapkowski twist. It's a beautiful song. And Freya, like, I don't think anyone really knew that she could sing. And I think she did a lovely job, and it's a well-composed and melodic song.
Yeah, I'm hoping that it's not just an Easter egg for people who kind of know the world, but I'm hoping that at some point they find a way to work in that story too. And I think they're going, they maybe have talked about it.
Next anime movie.
Oh, it's the next.
Yeah, so Doug Cockle's actually voicing Geralt in that.
Right.
And Joey Beatty will be Askier, so.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they make it all work out. And especially with the seemingly scaling back on things with calling it at 5 seasons and seemingly getting rid of the rats.
Film. Well, series, then
Whatever.
film, then
Yeah.
Maybe like a
episode.
limited
Yeah.
series. Yeah.
Yeah. It all feels very Netflix in terms of like, hey, we got something that's doing well. All right, we're going to cancel it.
Yeah.
Like the
Everything?
Oh yeah, the Shadow and Bone.
Oh, yeah.
Right before it's going to get good.
Yeah,
That's
I
a
was on
bummer.
Instagram, so I follow all the Netflix accounts, on Breakfast and Beauclair. And there was some show recently that like Netflix put up a post about it, and just all the comments were just like, bring back Shadow and Bone, bring back Shadow and Bone. I was like, I know, obviously that was very crushing cancellation for the fan base, but I had no idea people were still asking for it. Yeah.
It's like that.
Maybe someone else will pick it up. Like 6 seasons in a movie, we're just gonna like hop. I don't know. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, see what
Who knows?
CW and Peacock are doing.
Yeah, right? Come on. Yeah.
Well, and that's like, I mean, even HBO,
Yeah.
thanks to Warner Brothers Discovery these days, have been doing the same thing of like, oh, you like the series? We're going to cut it off right before the last season you were going to plan for. So,
Yeah.
with Our Flag Means Death. So,
Oh, I was so crushed. Like,
I was so sad.
yeah.
it's a business.
Yeah.
I don't get that side of it very often, but it's a business.
Yeah. Oh, they. Well, hopefully, we'll at least get to see this one through.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we get to our discussion questions? In this episode, as well as the same chapter in Time of Contempt, Ciri bears her time in Korath alone. What do you guys think might be the challenges and consideration in adapting such a singularly character-driven plot line? So do you think this episode was successful or unsuccessful in doing so? I think we talked about this a little bit, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think it was successful, and I think, as we've kind of mentioned, a lot of that is carried by Freya carrying the episode, as well as integrating other characters for it to interact with. And it was interesting rereading the chapter. Having watched the episode, I was like, oh, they added in Falka in a way that was like bigger or whatever than they did in the book. And I've reread the book. I'm like, oh, actually, no, there's this character that's not necessarily directly said this is Falka, and so I'm like, oh, that's actually on point, and they did a really good job with allowing that to kind of balance out. And so it's not literally just, we're not doing Castaway exactly where she's interacting with an object per se. So that, I think, helps that balance, along with the interstitial or bookending with what we see in Brokilon, kind of helps even that out a little bit as well.
Yeah. I also really liked the way they chose to, the people that she had her self-talk about were clearly those really positive, supportive, like internalized objects, not to get all shrinky. Yennefer's voice, Geralt's voice, the other Witchers who taught her things and supported her, that was coming from inside of her. Whereas the more kind of destructive conversations, I guess, were distal, right? So it's like Calanthe is outside of her talking to her, and that's not something that has settled inside of her. And so I thought it was really interesting, in addition to bringing back the great actors, which certainly worked out, there was that separation of, you could tell that she was really using those positive relationships and having those be more powerful to fight against those external forces that were really critical, that were not perhaps the most positive relationships that she had originally thought them to be. Mom has faults, grandma has faults. But I thought that that was a really interesting choice to have, the people that she has inside versus the people that she has outside. I thought that that was a really cool way to not make it so flat.
Yeah, absolutely. Normally on episodes of Breakfast and Beauclair, I try not to directly compare the books in the show because at some point it's not really a productive conversation. But I think it's very natural to do here, where this episode in particular is so much like the chapter in the books. I think because a lot of the book is obviously internal dialogue and her just literally slogging through the desert, and the pace of the book is really about survival. It is slow, it is grueling, and every decision that she's making, we are there with her. Obviously, there's a lot more efficiency and a lot more action that needs to come with bringing this to screen. But I think both of you kind of nailed why that adaptation was successful for the Netflix series, because they were able to kind of like externalize a lot of that internal conflict and dialogue, and also bring in some additional conflict that we didn't necessarily have in the books, because the books were exclusively about survival, whereas there's a lot more internal conflict in Ciri's head regarding kind of her place in the world. And when she gets out of this desert, what's going to happen? What's she going to be capable of? What are the things that are holding her back? What are her fears? Even all of the fears, like Calanthe points out. She's like, you've done nothing. You've contributed nothing. You've just been hiding. And, Ciri obviously is a breakdown about that. But we don't necessarily get that specific conflict in the books. So I thought that was interesting. And obviously the character of Falka kind of being a bit of an instigator for the whole episode, and kind of trying to get her to like indulge in all of these things that she wants to resist. So I do think it was nice to have more, both like obviously all the physical concerns and conflict and the situation being as dire as it is, but also kind of reminding us what's going on in her head and what the isolation actually does to her character and to her thoughts. As we've said, this is Ciri's first time, like really truly alone since escaping Cintra and meeting Geralt. How would you guys say her time with Geralt and Yennefer for the last 2 seasons has prepared for her to survive on her own?
I mean, I think kind of similar to our discussion about Witcher skills versus her using her magic, I think we sort of have seen a lot more of her time with Geralt and the Witchers with her kind of battle mode. And so you see her very effectively neutralize 2 monsters. She's clearly very prepared to do that. And I think that one of the things that's sort of unfortunate is that she was on her way to a path to really learn how to harness her magic, right? I mean, the whole point of Yennefer taking her to Aretuza was to learn and to, seek the experts. And she just never really had that opportunity. So while she has some understanding of her magic, it's just, there is a part of her that does seem to be particularly unprepared just because she hasn't had the opportunity, but like knowing that it's there, was clearly just such a source of frustration for her. And I think, if she had just simply had more time with Yennefer or, maybe with Tisea or somebody, she would have been more prepared. Just kind of like one of the unfortunate things about the way it shook out.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Kerri. Like, there was, I think, a lot of promise in her future with magic that we, unfortunately don't get to see, at least in this episode. But at least her physical skills, the ones that she's picked up from her time with Geralt and the Witchers, is obviously still there. She talks about the lessons that she learned from Messamir, being able to identify even where she is based on her time in Kaer Morhen. She's got the basics down, and I don't know if any of them taught her how to smash a lizard against a rock, but, here we are.
Or determine.
That was so, like, from like a creature standpoint, I was like, oh no,
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not a reptile person, but that hurt a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also did not teach her necessarily how to determine whether or not something is edible or should be eaten as well, unless we're taking the kind of Falka comments as something she had learned at some point in time, itching in through a kind of subconscious thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's certainly something where it's like, she's using the lesson from Cohen about the dew on the rock in the morning and a lot of the other kind of basic survival stuff. So,
yeah,
which lizards are poisonous might have been a good one too.
We'll just have to add that to the list and let them know for next time.
Yeah, for next school session.
Yeah. Right. So Ciri's struggles for survival depicts everything from her early desperation, kind of the promise of hope when she meets Little Horse, and these recurring dark visions. So how does her journey through this episode reflect her internal conflicts and her growing powers as a potential source for either chaos or salvation? What do you think are some of the conflicts that she's battling right now?
I mean, I think that one of the things that's so great about the fleshing out of Ciri's character is that Ciri is all of us, right? I mean, she's at a very tricky developmental stage. And I know we don't like officially know kind of how old she is.
Right.
But we can sort of just, from her interactions and whatnot, we can sort of place her maybe in the early mid-teens, maybe. This is a really difficult developmental time. And, I think that a lot of people sort of dismiss it as, teenage angst, but it is very real. It is absolutely universal. And she is in the thick of it. And so, she is, at a time where people are really hoping to develop their confidence. And so she's got her confidence in her Witcher skills, the confidence in her magic, that's obviously a little bit shaky, but, with the confidence that you build during this stage of development is really about how you then consolidate your identity and really sort of helps you understand where and how you show up in the world and some stability for who that person is. And we see and hear the internal Geralt, Yennefer kind of side of things versus the external kind of more destructive vibes. We've got Falka being like, well, why don't you maybe do this dangerous stuff? Like, maybe just kind of like go wild. Yeah, smoke these cigarettes, exactly. Oh my gosh. And I mean, it is a very human conflict. And, just on top of that, this is especially tricky for people who have had trauma early on in their life. And Ciri has, I think by the end of all of this, not to be a spoiler or anything, she has had like pretty much every kind of trauma that we have in our book, right? And just kind of thinking about her resilience, you can really come to understand really how important it was that Geralt has been totally 100% on her side since the beginning. And you can see that that's important for that like negotiation of self.
Anything to add, Danny? What do you think about those internal conflicts and how they were brought to screen?
In terms of how they were brought to screen, I feel like it functioned well, as we kind of talked about, from a nuts and bolts like production viewing standpoint of bringing in additional characters or whatever. It also made me think of, in terms of the internal dialogue, done in a way that felt more natural than. We also recently watched the original Dune adaptation.
Okay.
And there's a lot of like internal dialogue where it's literally just like the character kind of like in a voiceover sort of like weird thing. We had the subcaption on, and it's literally like how they have it captioned is like talking to themselves and then the dialogue. And I'm like, oh, all right, that's a choice. And I'm sure that from the books, it's, the Dune books, it's like trying to impart some sort of internal dialogue that as a reader you can read and it functions that way. And as a viewer, you have to come up with some sort of tool to make that work. And I thought they did it extremely well with both bits of the other characters just kind of scattered in, like Kerri said, the more positive influences, and then also the more kind of tangible in her head, maybe negative aspects of that. Part of that sort of stuff makes me start thinking about more plot concepts of, I always feel like Ciri's being manipulated or somebody is trying to manipulate her. And so I start thinking about, is this manifestation of Falka something else that is driving her to either relinquish her magic or maybe fully consume in the fire magic? Is there something else at play? And I don't know that that's necessarily a direction anybody's going with the show, but it's something that still, I think, kind of came to mind. And where things go from here is everybody wants a piece of Ciri, and is this part of somebody's puzzle on that, whether it's some character we know already like Vilgefortz or it's somebody yet to be revealed sort of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, I think with the things that both of you have brought to the table, I would definitely agree that a lot of Ciri's internal conflicts, like from episode 1 of this season, like Sherwood, all the way through to now, she spends a lot of time fixated on who she could become or who she's going to become. In the first episode, she kind of monologues to Geralt and Yennefer in Sherwood that like she has the power to change things. She understands both sides in a way that nobody else can. And I can make a difference. I will do this. And when she ends up in the desert, that is, given the circumstances, it's still kind of in her head. As you said, Kerri, she's in like a very influential point in her time in her life. And of course, she's, as Calanthe said, she spent all this time kind of being sheltered during Cintra, of course, but Yennefer and Geralt have done their best to protect her from everything that's out there in the world trying to get her. And so without them, there's that question of like, who is she going to become? And I think that that's like the biggest conflict that she has, is knowing that there's people outside, as you said, Danny, who want to manipulate her. Will she have the confidence and the self-awareness to follow the path that she wants? Or is she going to be kind of brought into a different kind of life? So I think that is open-ended for now.
Yeah, and I think that she's clearly, as a kid, like, I'm going to grow up and do great things, which is how most kids are, right? And, there is this notion early on, that if you put in your best effort, you will be successful. And that right or wrong is this black or white dichotomy. And that's not really the case. And, maybe even that the people that you looked up to that you thought were perfect are not perfect. And so there's a lot of the glass shattering around her at like each step of the desert. It's kind of like, well, actually, like my grandma wanted to like kill all people who are like me. That really sucks. And, really comes into conflict about everything that I know and loved about her. And, my mom really loved me, but, hey, I also feel kind of abandoned by her.
Mhm.
Yennefer gave me this magic coin and she is supposed to be able to find me when I recite the incantation, and it doesn't work. What's the point of having all this magic and power if I can't do anything with it?
Mhm.
And you could sort of see, because of these outside forces, like the weight of the world is on this little kid, and it's heavy. And, I think that it just sort of adds a layer to that conflict of she's just really going through it.
Well, and even Little Horse appears to be maybe some sort of hope for her, and then he takes right off. Multiple times
He
through the
rejects
course,
her,
and
right?
then,
Yeah.
and then truly seems to reject her and the use of fire magic, or that's at least how she perceives it. Whether or not he was like, "All right, cool, thanks, see ya,"
Right.
for other reasons, we don't know. But as you had said, every step, including not just the previous experiences, but the one she was actually going through in the moment as well.
And on that subject, Ciri's use of fire magic and her encounter with her visions of Falka raise questions about power and also consequence, I think. How do Ciri's conversations with Falka specifically shape her understanding of her own identity? And what does the subsequent relinquishment of her magic reveal about Ciri's character?
So I'm kind of like just kind of thinking this through now as we've had our discussion, but there's the hammering home of history and repeating itself. It's sort of, I can see how she might think that her identity or her destiny are sort of predetermined and that she maybe doesn't have a lot of choice. And, she sees Falka. I think that she might know that she's kind of like, hey, smoke this cigarette, and she knows that's wrong. And I wonder if that's kind of like, well, relinquishing my magic is the way to ensure that I do not become that person. And there's only one way to do it, is to say, hands up, I'm out.
Was to take herself off the board.
Yeah, off the board completely.
In a different way than Cuttinger and Ben were kind of discussing of like faking her death, that it's like she's kind of taking herself out. If I'm special for these reasons and I relinquish what makes me special, then nobody should care about me, right? Although there are other pieces, not just the magic, but also her lineage from a kingdom standpoint is also important, as that's clearly a piece of the Ymir puzzle of like, as the heir to Cintra, it's like, there's a political reason as well, and that's a little bit tougher to just relinquish. I think you can say, I don't want it all you want, but somebody's going to try and manipulate that for their own benefit, I imagine, at some point.
I think the conversations with Falka are interesting because Falka seems very almost charming, or she has like a specific allure to her that she is on Ciri's side when Pavetta and Calanthe aren't. So it's kind of like a different kind of like enabling voice. It's just like that little demon on your shoulder being like, well, you should have done this instead. You know better than to do that. Why don't you just try this? And it's enamoring and it's seductive in its own way, where like you want to listen to it. And I think with, the talk about history repeating itself, like Falka's story is something that is important in the books because Sapkowski uses it as kind of like a through line and lesson and everything throughout the story. But it is something that really hasn't been explored as heavily in the Netflix show, so I don't really mind that they use this episode as a way to kind of like efficiently explain who Falka is to viewers who might not know much about the lore and stuff. Because like we heard a bit from Stregobor, like I think in season 2, but now we kind of put a face to a name and all that other stuff. But I think we're like actually hearing Falka's story from her side rather than Stregobor being quite xenophobic and everything. But there's so much about Falka that horrifies Ciri, like the fact that she like killed her own family, and she's like, yeah, whatever. And Ciri's like, you like, really?
Yeah.
And so I think that conversation with Falka tells her a lot about the person she doesn't want to be and not necessarily about like the person that she wants to become. But when it comes to the fire magic itself and the relinquishment of it, we've, I think, again, seen fire magic externally, right? Like we saw it when Yennefer used it at the Battle of Sodden, and she was just crying tears of blood. We've seen it every time Rince has been on screen using fire magic. And we understand conceptually that it's forbidden, but we don't really know why. And this is the first time we're actually seeing firsthand the corruption that it can have to someone and why someone like Rince is really so dangerous and what he has sacrificed in order to leverage that. And because of Ciri's kind of like morals or purity, however you want to slice and dice it, that corruption, I think is something that she's very resistant to. We see visions of Jaskier being beheaded. Well, I guess it starts off with, was it Emir and then, or no, Vilgefortz, and who was it? It was somebody first and then Cahir. Both of them were dead.
Definitely Vilgefortz on like a pike or something like that.
Yeah. So she saw 2 of her enemies dead, but then the visions kept going, which again, like wasn't dissimilar from the book. So she saw Jaskier being beheaded, Yennefer being restrained, and Geralt's kind of being pulled on one of those medieval torture devices. Yeah.
Like Princess Bride.
Like,
Yeah, and that horrified her. And she's like, if this is what it costs, then no, I'm not ridding myself of my family, of my connections, of the people who love me, of people who I love. And then she says, I don't want it. And so, yeah, I think it's possibly a combination of what you said, Danny, where she doesn't want to be manipulated. And I think internally, she also doesn't want to sacrifice the things that make her human and the things that make her her and the connections that matter to her for the sake of power, which differentiates her from Falka.
Maybe there's something that I forgot about in the books of the series or something. But, there's this sort of canon of fire is destructive, it's dangerous, it'll kill us all. And obviously, we know fire in the real world is wildly unpredictable. It is destructive, but it can also be contained in a way, right? Like we have fireplaces and, torches, and, like there are things, like lamps, things like that. And I'm just kind of really wondering like where that's sort of seated, because when something is forbidden, it can't be studied. And so I'm just kind of wondering, what's his name? Fire guy.
Rents. Yeah.
Rents. We know that he was a like Bannard expellee. He was probably kind of a jackass to begin with. Was it fire that destroyed him, or was he kind of like on that way on his own? We see Yennefer lose all her magic at the Battle of Sodden, but is it because, you sort of tapped into everything, ran out your tank and blew out your fuse? If she had had the opportunity to learn more about it, maybe she could have used it more deliberately. And Falka represents this as, fire is something synonymous with like anger and rage. But I wonder if really it's powerful. Women got a hold of this magic and people were like, we don't want certain people to be this powerful. So we're just going to say it's dangerous and forbidden, get rid of it off the face of the planet and remove it completely. And that's just something that I'm thinking about in another variable of a world where, even Ciri herself is seen as an object and property because of what she can do and because the person who owns her wields that power. I am maybe a fire magic apologist, I guess. I feel like maybe we could figure this out. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting what you say. Like, when something's forbidden, it can't be studied. And I feel like it's also that kind of thing of like behind every rule and sign, there's probably a story for why that rule and sign is there.
Right.
So, yeah, I wonder, there's probably corruption aside, maybe there is more to that. I mean, as we come to the end of our discussion, do you guys have any final thoughts on episode 307, Out of the Fire into the Frying Pan?
I'm excited. Obviously, we know the gestalt of what's coming because they're not going to probably like change the story completely. But I'm excited to see how they do it. I like what I've seen so far. I'm team Yennefer 100%, always, everything Yennefer. And so I'm excited to see more of her. I think she's fantastic. I'm excited to give Hemsworth a shot.
Yeah.
He's
Of the people.
he's Australian, which is obviously like way cool. But he's like,
Ciri,
I got a job.
nar.
Nar. Oh my God. But I feel like I want to give him a shot. And, because he's like, hey, I got this job and now I'm going to do it. And I think that it's really exciting. I would have liked to see, I was really excited about the opportunity to see more of the rats.
Mm.
I find them really interesting. And I also thought that it would be a really cool opportunity for costumes because they tend to be a bit flashier. I'm interested to see, kind of like what they do with that. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably all I can say without major spoiling everything.
Yeah, and in terms of this actual episode, it transitions Ciri from being extremely reactionary to her surroundings to now maybe being a little bit more of an agent, have agency for herself. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that her time with the rats, who knows, we'll see where they go with that, how much agency she'll have for herself there as well. But I would think that they'll probably lean towards, making choices for the most part. And we'll see where that goes from there. Yeah. So I think that this episode works really well as kind of visualizing that transition in her character and where we really get Ciri as the main character of the rest of the journey. And, tying that along with the new actor playing Geralt, like, I think that's one of those things that, in theory, knock on all the wood in the world, hopefully functions well because, again, it is really her story at the end of the day, and particularly depending on how far they take it through the books and whether or not they dabble with any of maybe the Witcher 3 stuff that really kind of like expand on her importance potentially for the future sort of thing.
Yeah, I think this episode was a lovely translation from the books. I thought Freya Allen, like I said, just knocked it out of the park. No complaints. Really, really shown in this episode. So, as you said, I'm so excited to. I don't know, like, what the production was like between when she did Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes versus this, but I'm so excited to see, like, how much she has continued to grow since season 1 and what she's going to bring to season 4 and 5. Because I think if this episode is a preview of the kind of actress that she is becoming, we lucked out, I think, immensely having her for this series. And I'm really looking forward to it. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah.
She's fantastic. Yeah.
We'll say one thing from the movie Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I sometimes would refer to her as a feral little psychopath for some specific choices her character make. And that makes me very excited with where she could be going with this series in the next season.
She got range, yeah.
She can be vicious, I would say. In a good way.
Which we're going to need.
And that's what I mean. It's like, she's got all that vengeance and rage inside her. We might tap into that a little bit, I think, is what I think.
Well, that is certainly such a tease. My dad actually texted today. He was just like, so do you want to go see a movie? Maybe we go see Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. And I was like, so funny you say that, because the person I'm talking to today.
Yeah, you can stay for the credits.
Yeah, stay for the credits and see his name, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I know that person.
Yeah. And there is a very, very subtle, like at the very, very end of the credits sort of thing related to the actual movie.
Ooh.
It's like, oh, it's not like an actual post-credit scene, but there's like a little something.
A little treat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not super obvious either, but, without saying what happens in the movie, there's a little bit of, oh, okay.
Well, based on when this podcast episode comes out, I hope that you, our audience, take the time to go see Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, support Dani, and support Freya. And I think that's going to take us to the end of our show for today. And Dani, Kerri, thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode. And thank you to our Hanza for listening. So where can people find you both? And is there anything that our community can help you with or anything that you would like to share with them?
Yeah, so I think one of your other guests said that they can be summoned on the Discord. I also can be summoned on the Discord.
Yes.
I've been trying to get in there a little bit more. Usually I just pop in, once a week and like everybody's pet photos. But I've tried to be a little bit more involved. Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, that's animals on the internet are the only reason it exists. And then, so I'm kind of like doing something with Instagram account that I have that's at positively_sartorial. It's not much yet, but it's, I'm thinking that it'll probably be kind of a space for just getting more diverse thinking and conversations going about having different bodies in the media and different ideas about what is appropriate dress and things like that. I think the only thing I have up there is like business casual with a big line through it so far. But yeah, so, I'm going to do something with that, eventually if people want to follow. But yeah, if anybody has any good macrame patterns, I'm also really interested in those as well.
Love that. What about you, Dani?
And then I'm on the Discord quite a bit more than Kerri. And then on Instagram, I can be found at Ordered Chaos Official, which is my DJing name that I haven't been as good about as lately, but is something where I do bedroom record DJ sets and post them online, mostly trance electronic music with a skew towards remixes and pop music influences. As I kind of got into that more I used to DJ a little bit at the F45 studio that I go to.
Oh, really?
And so I felt like, I got to mix it up in a way that's like, one, keep you working out hard, and then also still in my wheelhouse of the music that I like to DJ and listen to. So
that's so funny. Yeah, I was a big F45 girl for about a year and a half until I got hired by a competitor fitness company. But yeah, they would bring in a DJ every Saturday to while we were working out.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was me for a bit
Woo-woo!
at Culver City. So.
Yeah, my only class that I went to, you were DJing. It was good. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, it's, like I said, so lovely to have you both on the show. And again, congratulations on your first Breakfast with Beauclair podcast episode, Kerri. And Dani, thank you again for coming back.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. And next episode, join us as we conclude our discussion of The Witcher Season 3 with episode 308, The Cost of Chaos. Thanks for joining us at The Breakfast Table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and complete list of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastandbeauclair.com. Breakfast and Beauclair is created by Alyssa from GoodMorhen. It's hosted by Alyssa. The show is edited by Alyssa and Sherry Guo with music by Alex Berner. Breakfast and Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B., Charlotte from Edinburgh, Glamry, the original Roche, Libby, John of Rivia, Tom from Australia, Jill Keep the Tabby Witch, Ollie from Sweden, James Carson III, Miriam of Temeria, Softy, Lisa C., and Red Kite. Special thanks to Dani and Kerri for joining us for this episode and our international Hanza for their support.